So, when do you think business games were first introduced for training? Games to teach executives and managers how to do their jobs. Was it the 1980s, the 2000s with the advent of video games, or was it the 1950s, or even perhaps a little earlier? And for valuable bonus points, in what country did they start? Hi, I'm Carl Kopp, game and gamification professor, researcher, consultant, learning game developer, and writer. Today, let's talk about the origin of corporate games for learning. Let's not wait any longer. Here's the answer. It's 1930s. Did you guess that? That's what we consider to be the beginning of modern business games. So in the 1930s, a woman named Mary Berstein from, get ready, the USSR, where of course they know games, they invented Tetris. So Mary came from there and she created a direct predecessor to modern business simulation games. In fact, she's often been called the mother of Soviet simulation gaming, or simply the founder of business gaming. Berstein was a high ranking manager in the Russian Bureau for the Scientific Organization of Work when it was merged into the Leningrad Institute of Engineering and Economics. There's a little bit of an alliteration for you. So while she was teaching at the Leningrad Institute, Berstein got the idea to adapt the concept of war games to a business environment. And then a little bit later on, we'll discuss what are war games and how they work and how they came about. But for now, in 1932, Berstein developed a teaching exercise that simulated the assembly process at a typewriter factory. And for those youngins in the audience, you'll have to Google the term typewriter. She used this exercise to train managers on how to handle different and various production problems. Okay, so think of this. In the 1930s in USSR, there was vast new construction programs in many places in the country to attempt to rapidly build production capability and to compete with the West. Unfortunately, gearing up that quickly caused some problems, and notably the lack of skilled personnel to manage all the different construction programs and all the building of the factories. So at the time, the USSR had a population of folks who did not have the experience necessary to work at scale in large industrial settings, and that caused production delays, bottlenecks, and other problems. So enter Mary Berstein. As part of a team tasked with solving the problems, one of the things that she and the team did was travel to several construction sites to observe what was happening so they could better solve the problem. And for those of you keeping score at home, that's good old fashioned needs assessment right there. That's instructional design 101, audience analysis. Anyway, and task analysis. Anyway, the team realized that there needed to be a way for the planners and managers and other folks to understand how to deal with the potential problems and to understand how the various aspects of the projects interacted with each other before they jumped into managing real-world projects. So at this point in time, Mary Berstein thought to herself, I can use the simulation techniques from war games to help teach the planners, managers, and others how the entire process works. Only, of course, without the death and destruction of war activities like acquiring enemy territory and destroying enemy resources or troops. Instead, substitute economic and logistical issues and keep it peaceful and productive. As mentioned earlier, this started in a typewriter factory, and interestingly, before this time, all the typewriters in the USSR were imported, so this was new on many levels. And at the time, Mary was only 30 years old, and she didn't want to call her new training idea a game because she felt others might not view this as a serious exercise. It's great to see organizations, right, have made it so far. Game is still a four-letter word in a lot of companies. But Mary and her team were able to create the simulation, and they were able to give it to the managers, and it was organized, modeling the plant. And they taught people the right arrangement of workers, machines, and resources. It turns out a big success. Then other games, simulations were created during that time, covering topics like the movement of goods or logistics, improving labor productivity, and even how to respond to accidents in electrical power stations. In 1936, a simulation game called Red Weaver, although that wasn't the name at the time, was developed, which depicted production conditions in a large-scale textile factory. Now, Red Weaver is not as exciting as Red October, but still an interesting name for that type of simulation. Anyway, the simulation required that managers of the plant with a 48-hour period reorganize the production process to manufacture only two types of cloth goods with constraints added, just for fun, such as a 20% reduction in staff and a series of other crises that umpires would introduce into the game. The managers were in one room playing their game, the simulation, and the umpires or judges of the game, which is typical in war games, were in another room. The judges kept score and would periodically introduce a crisis or other elements that would occur during a typical operation of a plant. They guided the simulation and the game. This too was a highly successful simulation, and the results of the gaming simulation were first published way back in 1938. And in fact, between 1932 and 1940, over 40 simulations dealing with various aspects of industry were all created. But with the advent of World War II, it was heating up, and resources became focused on fighting the Nazis. Mary and others took on other tasks. She returned to gaming, though, after the war and was very active in the field for many years, making many significant contributions until her passing at 90 years old in 1992. She was truly a remarkable woman. So now you know that business simulations were first introduced in the 1930s in the USSR by a smart, enthusiastic woman named Mary Berstein. So what can we take away from this history? I think there are three things to consider. First, games have been used for a while for learning and development. They're not this newfangled thing that just popped up. We're not the first ones to experiment or use that. In fact, games are tried and true, so we can learn lessons from those who came before us, what was successful, what wasn't. Second, conducting a needs assessment or a needs analysis of the learner's need is really important. It goes a long way in creating the right learning game. Mary and her team traveled to those construction sites to ensure they knew the ins and outs of what the workers were facing. So analyze your audience. There are lots of ways to conduct an audience analysis. Use design thinking or instructional design or create personas. But whatever you do, find out what the learners are facing on a daily basis before you create your game. And finally, computers are not required to run an effective learning game. In the 1930s, umpires, aka humans, acted as the engine of the game and realistically depicted the happenings related to running an actual factory. So now you know a little bit about the first business games ever used in corporations. Let's talk about the concept of wargaming, which is the foundation upon which Mary built her business games.